Okay, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off in class, and that was talking about McCarthyism. So we've covered pretty much most of McCarthyism, but the few things I want to still cover are Arthur Miller's famous play from the 1950s called The Crucible. This may be something you look at in AP Lang, but basically The Crucible is going to be set during the Salem witch trials, but is a true metaphor for McCarthyism during the 1950s. Okay, and we're going to move on to the election of 1948. Truman is going to defeat Dewey in a stunning upset. The Electoral College votes are going to be 303 to 189. You need 270 to clinch the nominations. And basically, the Democrats are going to be split into three different groups. Truman, the Southern States Rights Party, led by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, a very famous senator that was against the civil rights movement, and a new progressive party under Henry Wallace. So again, the Democrats were split into three separate camps. Thomas Dewey is going to be nominated by the Republicans. Earl Warren, who is going to be the soon chief of the Supreme Court, is going to be the vice presidential nomination. Platform for the Republicans included anti-big labor and a reduction of FDR's New Deal policies. Truman is going to call for housing, full employment, and a higher minimum wage, better for support for farmers, a brand new version of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and extension of Social Security, and more rights for African Americans. Truman is going to end up winning re-election because of support from farmers, labor, and blacks who felt very threatened by the Republican Party. So remember, we talked about with FDR that we see a shift with African Americans not supporting the Republican Party anymore. They're going to continue to support the Democrats. Democrats are also going to get a clear majority in both houses of Congress. All right, and then we're going to move on to the Vital Center, which was from 1948 to 1968, and this is the new political consensus developing in America. There's three major components to the Vital Center, common in both major parties. So both parties at this time are anti-communism, and they like containment. Belief that economic growth can solve all of society's problems is going to be something else both parties agree on. Political pluralism. Belief that a variety of ideas can compete in America. So the Vital Center is what's going to elect Truman in 48. They're going to switch to the Republican side and vote in Eisenhower in 52 and 56, Kennedy in the 1960s, and Johnson in 1964. So this political movement here is what is they're going to swing from Democrat to Republican to Democrat. The flaws are in the Vital Center is the Vietnam War is going to show us the problems with our containment policy, which is why we move away from containment after Vietnam. 25% of Americans during this time are living in poverty. So the economic boom of the 1950s and early 60s did not help everybody. And Jim Crow laws are still in the South, which is showing a true lack of pluralism in America. By 1968, the Vital Center is going to be completely gone. We're going to have this thing called the Hawks versus the Dove. War hawks versus peace doves. And that is going to amplify our generation gap that we're coming into with the counterculture movement that we're going to talk about here in the 1960s. White conservatives are going to form a backlash against liberalism, such as Johnson's Great Society programs, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. All right, so we're going to move on to Truman's Fair Deal. In 1949, Truman called for a fair deal, including housing, full employment, higher minimum wage, better farm support, new TVA, extension of Social Security, and increased rights for African Americans. I mentioned this just a minute ago. All right, his only major successes were in raising the minimum wage, in public housing, and extending old age insurance to more beneficiaries. And this is going to be the Social Security Act of 1950. All right. Truman is in essence able to preserve most of FDR's New Deal programs, but he is unable to add any of his own. The coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats are going to prevent any more programs being added. In 1952, Truman is going to decide not to run for re-election. This is going to be for a couple of reasons. One, we are militarily deadlocked in Korea. The war has created a large inflation in our economy, and there's some issues with the Internal Revenue Department and a little bit of a White House scandal to go with it. Adlai Stevenson is going to run on the Democratic ticket against Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Adlai Stevenson is actually, interesting enough, going to be our UN ambassador during the Cuban Missile Crisis under JFK. Election of 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was our Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and in charge of D-Day during World War II, is going to defeat Adlai Stevenson on the Electoral College 442 to 86, and President Nixon, or soon-to-be President Richard Nixon, is the vice presidential candidate. So one of the big changes in society post-World War II from 1945 to 1970 is the GI Bill of Rights. This is going to be also known as the GI Bill. This is going to kind of be a way to stop what people feared happened after World War I with the race riots in 1919, and just the general unrest of high unemployment after World War II. So to head that, or high unemployment after World War I. So to kind of stop that from happening again, we are going to come up with the GI Bill of Rights. So we have 15 million GIs, which are soldiers returning from World War II. We have the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which is basically government money to send millions of veterans to school, whether that's college or technical school. Majority are actually going to go to technical schools. Eventually, about $4.5 million is spent on the program. The Veterans Administration, or also known as the VA, gives about $16 billion in loans to veterans to be able to buy homes, farms, or small businesses. And the bill is going to continue to provide economic prosperity for our military as they come back from World War II. So this is a way to prevent the bonus army that happened after World War I, and like I mentioned earlier, the race riots. And the baby boomers. So many of your parents may be considered baby boomers. So in 1950s, or shortly after really the end of the war, we're going to have a population boom. And that's why it's known as the baby boomers. So by the 1950s, the population in America grew to over 28 million people. That's a lot of babies. 97% of that was in urban and suburban areas. Between 1946 and 1961, 63.5 million babies were born. So if your parents were born between 1946 and 1961, they are considered a baby boomer. Proportional growth in population is pretty much unprecedented in American history. We have never seen this type of population growth ever. And this has a lot to do with servicemen returning from World War II. They were rather young when they went, and so they would come back and get married. And we're also going to have an economic boom during this time period. We're going to see a new rise in the middle class again. So we've seen a rise early with the Second Industrial Revolution and progressivism during that time period. Now we're going to see another rise in the middle class. This is going to become the affluent society. So by the 1950s, our national income has doubled, and it doubles again in the 1960s. So America is now enjoying about 40% of the world's wealth, despite only counting for 6% of the world's population. By mid-1950s, 60% of all Americans own their own homes, compared to only 40% in the 1920s. A majority of post-war jobs are going to go to women, and those are going to happen in urban office buildings and shops. By the 1990s, women are going to account for half of the total workforce. There's going to be a clash in the demands of suburban domesticity with realities of employment, which is going to partly be sparked because of the feminist revolt and the women's movement we're going to see in the 60s. The economy is going to greatly grow because of the defense industry. By the 1960s, 50% of our national budget goes to defense, and that is still true today. Cheap energy and increased supply of power is going to facilitate growth, rising productivity due to more education and new technology. All right, and we now have consumerism too. We have disposable incomes, and we are going to buy 1 or 2 cars. We are going to buy fancy gadgets for our homes. We are going to take vacations to new wonderful places known as Disney Worlds and Disneyland. Disneyland is celebrating their 60th anniversary as of last year. And the middle class is nearly at about 12 million by the population by the early 1960s, where in 1947, the middle class accounted for only 5.7 million of our population. In the 1950s, this idea of suburbs is going to grow 6 times faster than cities. And this is going to be because of car production, white flight from urban areas due to black migration into northern and midwestern cities, and government policies that ensure both builders and homeowners. Okay, the cult of domesticity is going to reemerge. So we've got a little synthesis here. All right, so we're going to have new science, quote unquote science, supports the idea that women could only have fulfillment in their lives if they were a homemaker. The concept is going to place women in the hold is going to be very, very popular in both society and magazines and television. So we have the rise of consumer products, which means most homes in America are going to buy their first television set. And the popular shows in the 1950s are the Leave It to Beavers, Father Knows Best, and Ozzie and Harriet. All show women in a domestic role, not working outside the home. Then we're going to have Dr. Benjamin Spock, and he is going to basically tell us how to raise our babies. And the best way for parents to be able to raise their babies is for women to stay home and nurture their children. Parents should also trust themselves as they attend to their child's physical and psychological needs. And Dr. Spock is going to actually sell 1 million copies of his book every year between 1946 and 1960. All right, and then we're going to have what's known as the Sun Belt versus the Frost Belt. The Frost Belt is also known as the Rust Belt, so make sure you know it as the Rust Belt as well. So the Sun Belt is going to contain 15 states stretching from Virginia down to Florida, across to Texas, Arizona, and California. So think of the southern part of the United States. They are warmer, they are sunnier, they get sun more days out of the year than the cold north. Air conditioning is going to be used in the 1950s and actually installed in residential homes. Therefore, people move to these sunny areas like Arizona and New Mexico because they can now cool their homes down and make it livable. The aerospace and military industry is going to attract millions to Texas, Florida, and California. And every president elected since 1964 is going to come from a Sun Belt state until Barack